The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
To the Department of Healthcare Access and Information, HCAI, Fire Resistance Rated Assemblies presentation, brought to you by the Fire Prevention Unit here at HCAI. Today, we will go through fire resistance rating, building elements, the different types of rated construction, and much more. You can find the handout ready to download for your use at the Handouts tab on the Go-To panel. The length of this presentation is from 10 a.m. to 11:30, so an hour and a half, but may end early depending on how many questions you have. Now, what about the questions? If you have a question during the presentation, please type it in of the Go-To panel. And we will answer those questions at the end of the presentation the best that we can. Please keep your question generic, but if you have a project-specific question, please send it to regsunit@hcai.ca.gov, regsunit@hcai.ca.gov. If the presentation experienced transmissions difficulties, don't be frustrated. Please log out and log back in using the same login information sent by the Go-To software when you register for the presentation. Today, for presenter, we have Nanci Timmins, Chief Fire and Life Safety Officer, Fire Prevention Unit at the Facility Development Division at HCAI. Once again, thank you for joining us. So Nanci, if you're there, I hand the presentation over to you.
Thank you very much, Monica. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this presentation. As Monica mentioned, we're going to talk about fire-resistive rated assemblies. And for some, this may be a refresher, and for some, this may be new information. A lot of it's right from the code. So, in going from the code, I know it's not fun to read code, but I'm going to be doing that sometimes because that's part of the best way to get the information out first. I'll read it and then talk about it typically. But this presentation, we're going to focus on the different types of rated assemblies, the walls, the horizontal assemblies, and which is which. There are some people are still using old code language for naming the walls. Some don't know, what wall is what. Some do, but forget. But anyhow, so we'll just go over this a bit. We won't get into the opening protectives part today. So more will come. That's part of the ending there. More will come. We'll do another presentation and focus more on the openings. So you might want to think of it as a basics and then advanced, potentially. But anyhow, either way, hopefully it's helpful. As Monica said, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. Let us know. And depending on timing, we might stop and answer as we go or do them at the end. But please feel free to ask questions. And if you don't get them in now because you're processing information as I'm speaking and you come up with something later, please feel free to contact me. So with that, I'll begin. Maybe. Let's see if this wants to advance. All right, as I mentioned, we're pulling a lot of it right from the code, but you'll see some other information in here. So this is just kind of you've got fire smoke protection features in the code. This kind of just gives a little summary of where do we find this stuff in the code. So Chapter 7 provides the detailed requirements for the fire-resistive rated construction, and then includes the structural members, walls, partitions, and horizontal assemblies. But other portions of the code describe where these fire resistance rated elements are required. So 7 tells you how to build it, how to construct it, and then how the openings are protected and how penetrations are protected. So again, when and where you need these assemblies, you're going to find those in different parts of the code, but 7 is going to be more specific of, okay, now you know you need them, how do you build them? And some of those other parts that you'll find them, of course, are in Chapter 5, chapter 4. Chapter 5, you have incidental uses when you're separated versus accessory. Chapter 4, your specifics for suites, etc. So those are just some of the examples of where you would find where you need a type of assembly, what type of assembly you need. And then again, going to chapter 7 to tell you how it is built. So starting with the very beginning, like you do with any chapter or section, is looking at the scope of this, looking at every chapter is going to have the scope. The beginning of every section will have a general section that will say, what is this section specifically for? So 7011's at the very beginning of 7. It's the scope for the whole chapter. The provisions of this chapter shall govern the materials and assemblies used for structure, fire resistance, and fire resistance rated construction, separation of adjacent spaces to safeguard against the spread of fire and smoke within the building and the spread of fire to or from buildings. And then there's a section for 702 for multiple use assemblies. Many of you know when you have multiple use assemblies, all the requirements in the most stringent especially have to apply, but where is that in the code? So that's 702.1. And that again is the section that says fire assemblies that serve multiple purposes in a building shall comply with all the requirements that are applicable for each of the individual fire assemblies. So some examples, now this isn't using the code terminology, which is actually what I'm going to hone in on a little bit later or in a couple more slides. But the reason I have these in this slide like this, like occupancy separation, for example, set of fire barrier, is because if you look at these different types of uses, there are multiple kinds of fire barriers listed in here. So for example, the first one, you've got corridor wall and an occupancy separation, otherwise known as a fire partition and a fire barrier. What happens when you have both? You have your room that's along a corridor that's a different occupancy type that requires a fire barrier around it. Which wall requirements do you go with? Both of them, and then be certain that the most stringent requirements are applied. And another example that we often see is the occupancy separation and a smoke barrier. Both fire barriers, right? Fire barrier and then fire barrier, smoke barrier, same thing. What both requirements for both apply, and then the more stringent with the smoke barrier come into play as well. Exit enclosures and occupancy separations. Again, both types of fire barriers, but different uses and different requirements for protection. And then corridor wall and incidental use, fire partition and a fire barrier, but different than the one that is in the first example. So just some examples of the different types that you'll see, that you have multiple uses for these types of walls, and making sure that you're looking at everything that's needed for both the types or more. Sometimes there's more than two. And making sure that all the requirements are met, and again, the most restrictive apply. So talking about fire resistance rating, what is that? Chapter 2 is sometimes a chapter that's forgotten to be looked at, but it is hugely important chapter. Not enforceable, but certainly important to figure out what we're talking about in the code. So a fire resistance rating is defined as, and we find this again in chapter 2, the period of time a building element, component, or assembly maintains the ability to confine a fire, continues to perform a given structural function, or both, as determined by the test or the methods based on test prescribed in 703. So again, fire resistance rating, we're talking about building elements. How are those building elements protected? This is separate than a fire protection rating. We'll talk about fire protection rating later. So sometimes that language is used interchangeably, but these are two different things. A fire resistance rating, you're talking about the protection for your building elements. What are those, right? Because you got all kinds of elements in a building. What are your building elements? Again, from chapter 2, building element is a fundamental component of building construction listed in table 601, which may or may not be a fire resistance rated construction and is constructed of materials based on the building type of construction. What's the construction type? What are those materials allowed to be made out of or constructed out of? And then what are those elements? Again, so what's in table 601 for building elements? You've got your primary structural frame, your exterior and interior bearing walls, the non-bearing walls and partitions at the exterior that may or may not need protection, but that would get into a little bit later or other sections. And then non-bearing walls and partitions for the interior, floor construction and associated secondary members, and then roof construction and associated secondary members. So these are your building elements that, again, I'm going to go backwards, that are the fire resistance rating. That's what that applies to. And these are the components we'll be talking about today as well, obviously, as the different types. So then what's fire protection rating? The fire protection rating is the period of time that an opening protective will maintain the ability to confine a fire as determined by tests prescribed in 716. And then ratings are stated in hours or minutes. So again, just like fire resistance rating, don't confuse the two different things. Fire protection rating, resistance rating. So fire protection rating, right in the definitions, talking about opening protectives. What are those? Opening protectives: a fire door assembly, fire shutter assembly, fire window assembly, or glass block assembly in a fire resistance rated wall or partition. So obviously they're related to each other, right? You've got these openings and these walls, but there are different areas in the code to go to determine how these are to be protected, what they're to be rated at, and then of course how they're constructed. Something we see a lot on plans still to this day, even though the code language changed back in 2007. We see, well, even this doesn't even have the old code language on it, but this is taken right from a plan. And we see this a lot in plan review where the walls are just called new 1 hour, existing 1 hour, new 2, existing 2, 3 hour, what, a 2 hour what, a 1 hour what. This is very important to name the walls what they are in accordance with the code. What does the code name them? Is it a 3 hour firewall? Is it a 2 hour firewall? Is it a fire barrier? This is just, example, but you don't have to use this exactly, but naming them, yes, please name the walls as what they're called in the code. Is it a fire partition? Is it a fire barrier? Firewall, smoke barrier? What is the wall that we're talking about? And please label them on all the pages that are applicable. So not just the A pages, but showing these walls on the mechanical, electrical, and other deferred drawings is very helpful in plan review. So imagine having, deferred fire alarm and the wall types aren't indicated. Where do we need dampers? So that's automatically going to be a comment and a back check, right? So save some time, coordinate the wall and the wall legends, name the walls what they are, and put them on all the applicable plans. We have had recently actually a project that went through design, plan review, and into construction, and the wall was called a 1 hour wall. And it was built as a 1 hour fire partition, but it was required to be a 1 hour fire barrier. So maybe the designer assumed everyone looking at this knows this is going to be a 1 hour fire barrier. Maybe the plan reviewer assumed the same, but the individuals on site constructing the wall, they did not know. So they built it as a 1 hour fire partition, and now this 1 hour fire partition surrounding this room that needed a 1 hour fire barrier did not have the proper door, the proper type of dampers, etc. So not something you want to see at construction, and certainly could have been resolved with having plans submitted with the proper information on it. So it seems very basic, but it's really, really important. Please label the walls, their proper names, what they are, indicate their ratings. For example, again, these are just examples, and some of this may look familiar to you from the Tips from the Experts webinar from ages ago, but label it. You don't have to do it this way, but clearly label what the wall is, and then what's the rating. And the first example is for fire barriers. is that have a special function that need to be identified in the plans, you may use the following. It just, again, it's just an example, but the example here is for a horizontal exit or exit passageway required to be 2 hours. So there's a 2 with a little X. Smoke partitions, which enclose elevator lobbies, and smoke barrier walls, which separate smoke compartments. It should be a unique graphic because we want to follow that smoke barrier all the way through as well. So when it's most of the time it has multiple uses and combines with other walls like fire partitions or crosses areas where they're incidental use, or whichever. You want to have all the wall types, but in this example, it's saying it's a 1 hour smoke barrier. And then the last one is just examples for labeling the fire walls, where you're creating separate buildings that are they have limited or no penetrations that are allowed potentially, depending on the scenario, and also have to be continuous from exterior to exterior. There's some examples to use. So not only naming them properly, but adding what is the hourly rating of those walls on that plan. Some other information on the plan that's helpful is putting the provisions for the fire resistance rating of structural members and exterior walls, firewalls, and fire barriers, and then the location and construction of shaft enclosures, the provisions for the fire resistance ratings of fire partitions, smoke barriers, smoke partitions, and horizontal assemblies, and provisions for the fire resistance protection of penetrations and fire resistant joint systems, details and locations of opening protectives, ducts, and air transfer openings, provisions for fire blocking and draft stopping in concealed spaces, and then references to the prescriptive fire resistance tables in CBC, the fire tests from the approved labs, or fire resistance calculations, whichever method you are going to be using from 703.3. Usually, and just as a side note, there's a listed approved assembly, that listed approved assembly is what is to be used. There are allowances for, as you know, with EJs and using the table, of course, those are in there. But if there's listed approved assemblies, then those are to be used. The others are options if you can't find one. But we'll have a whole different webinar on EJs, so I won't get into that too much. But UL, for example, has improved their site tremendously. So in finding the assembly that you need should not be hard to do. You don't have to flip through those volumes and volumes of UL books. You haven't had to do that for years, but the site, even within the last year, has really changed and makes finding what you need really easy. What construction do you have? Is it steel? Are you looking at something where it's concrete? Whatever you have that you plug, there's so many search items in there that you can plug into that it really makes it easy to find a listed approved assembly. Anyways, I'm going to stay off that though. Talking about wall priority, we've talked about walls with multiple uses. What needs to be shown on the plan as well is your wall priority. You have walls that, as mentioned, look at if you can see the top one. I know this is minimized a little bit, but you've got a 1 hour fire partition adjacent to what appears to be the 2 hour, right? The 2 hour wall. So the 2 hour wall is going to have the priority in this case. So show how when you have these walls intersecting with each other, which wall has the priority and how does that look in the details? Because again, you're looking at construction documents out there building this. One, we need to see it, of course, but out there building it, how are they going to construct this? And having the wall priority details is really helpful. We have a little bit of a cheat sheet for wall priorities too. What's the highest priority? What's the lowest priority? And how should the details look with that in mind? You may have 2 1 hour walls coming together, like a 1 hour fire smoke barrier and a 1 hour incidental use fire barrier. What's that going to look like on the plans, and which has priority? Make sure to detail those. Make sure to detail those out. Take a look at this legend that we have created to help you out with that as well, and that can help you when you're trying to do your wall priority legend. So into the different types. This is the part where we're going to read more code. So get your coffee or your sugar, whatever you might need to get through the code reading, but I'll hopefully keep it somewhat entertaining for you. So a firewall, what is that? And what is it defined as? A fire resistance rated wall having protected openings, which restricts the spread of fire and extends continuously from the foundation to or through the roof with sufficient structural stability under fire conditions to allow collapse of construction on either side without collapse of the wall. So you've got this wall, and on one side of it is a building, on the other side of it's a building. If either one of those buildings goes up in flames, floors come down, roof comes down, that wall is still standing. That's a hard wall to build. And same with the other side. It doesn't matter and some people think, oh, it just matters if the fire starts on this side. We don't know what side fire is going to start on. What we do know is that we need a firewall standing regardless of what happens on either side of that wall. Again, very difficult wall to build properly, but it's not impossible. And recent editions of the code, which we'll talk about, have given other allowances, like front of page 221, that make it a little bit easier. But again, the goal is you have this wall rated at what the code says it needs to be rated, that remains standing even if a building adjacent to it is crumbled on the ground. The language in the orange here just kind of gives you a little bit background. So the language, I shouldn't say in the orange, there's a couple of orange. This part on the bottom here is a little explanatory language here. So talking about having it have to stand on its own. And then the part I didn't mention was no horizontal offsets. The horizontal offsets aren't permitted in a firewall. So what are firewall types? Firewalls and party walls, which we don't see party walls too much. We're usually dealing with firewalls, but you would just talk about code and code. There's the two of them. You may have them. This is the example. You see the picture, and you'll see it again in the presentation later. This looks like a mess structurally, right? But fire-wise, this is great. Well, not for the building in the middle, but for the other buildings, this is great. They the walls did what they were supposed to do. Are they perfect structurally? No, but they're there, and they provided the protection that was needed. That's what a firewall needs to do. So the general section for firewalls says firewalls shall be constructed in accordance with 7062 through 11. The extent and location of such firewall shall provide a complete separation, where a firewall also separates occupancies that are required to be separated by a fire barrier wall. The most restrictive requirements of each separation shall apply. So yes, even though 702 already told us that when you have multiple wall types, the requirements for each apply, and the most stringent, of course, has to be there. Firewalls wants you to hear it again. So code's not super clear. Well, it is, but you kind of have to know where to go. When are the firewalls required? And you get there through different sections of code, or you can just read this slide. So it's when you're separating two different types of construction to allow for area and height increases, and for two adjacent walls of buildings that share a lot line. So the separating two different types of construction is pretty easy to understand. You got two different construction types, so you need a firewall in between because you essentially have two different buildings. And then to allow for area and height increase, you've got your construction type, and the type that you chose has limitations, unless you chose 1A. So please do, I'm just kidding. You choose what you want. But anyhow, so you've got these limitations in chapter 5 for area and height increases. And what you are designing exceeds what's allowed, what is permitted per the tables and the area calculations that you can do. So what are some options? One of them would be create different buildings out of those firewise, not necessarily structurally, but firewise, and putting up firewalls in between, or change the construction type. But however, we're just talking about firewalls right now. And then two adjacent walls of buildings that share a lot line. So lot line, not assumed property line, but a deeded lot line. So you got two adjacent walls of buildings that share a true lot line, then you need a firewall in between those buildings. And then just some visuals for those three components. So this one's showing you the two different types of construction with the firewall in between. And as this one says, you need a 3-hour based on the type of construction, and you get that rating from table 706.4. So you know that you need a firewall. What rating is it that is needed? Go to table 7604. We will get there. Here's the visual for the area and height increase example. Without that firewall, this would not work. So they put the firewalls in to make this work with the area calcs and height increases. And then of course with the lot line. And then in that case, that's going to be the party wall. So an occupancy classification and construction types of both buildings 1 and 2 in this example determine the fire resistance rating of the firewall. Again, leads you to 706.4. The section that everybody seems to now love, of course, well, part of it, they only love half of it. The first half, the firewall shall be designed and constructed to allow collapse of the structure on either side without collapse of the wall under fire conditions. Again, reiterating that, that's super important. That's the goal of this wall. It's the purpose of this wall goal. And then firewalls designed and constructed in accordance with NFPA 221 shall be deemed to comply with this section. So as I mentioned, it's super, super hard to build a firewall properly, and especially when it's a single wall, especially in existing buildings, right? We're coming up with this with some of our 1R buildings. If they're going to go to locals, they need a firewall. That's hard to do. Now, it's hard to do new when you're just starting with dirt. It's really hard to do when you've got 2 buildings next to each other, or one that you're adding on to. So having the code allowing NFPA 221 provisions is really helpful, but you really got to look at this closely. There are some misconceptions. I had a plan the other day, not a plan, it was a question the other day about a firewall, and that firewall that they called a firewall was a 3-hour wall, which 3 hours was needed. However, it was not a 3-hour firewall. What was presented to us was a 3-hour fire barrier. Really big problem when that's in construction. That's not a 3-hour fire barrier, doesn't equal a 3-hour fire wall. And in that case, they were using JIP. But here's a table that you might want to take a screenshot of or save the slide if you're printing out the presentation. This gives the equivalency of if you choose to use NFPA 221, what do you need? You need 2. It's a double, I say fire barrier, but you've got a double wall that's supposed to be equivalent to a single firewall. So if 7064, table 7064 indicates you need a 3-hour firewall, and you want to use NFPA 221 to double fire barriers essentially to create a firewall, then you need 2 4-hour walls to be equivalent to a single 3-hour wall. And similarly, if the table requires a 2-hour rating, then you need 2 3-hour fire barriers. And then for a 1-hour rating, you need the 2. So you're looking at your double walls here. So if you're using 221, you're not going to have just a single wall that looks similar to a fire barrier. You're going to have 2 of those butting up against each other. And when you're looking at 221, remember that, yes, the code allows you to construct these walls in accordance with 221, but when there are more specifics in the building code, you still have to comply with those requirements in the building code. So keep that in mind when you're designing these, and also take a look at the end of 221 in the appendix. They give a lot of great examples of how these walls could be constructed, and they even give some examples of how you might design the openings, because again, our firewall is supposed to have horizontal offsets. No. How do you put a door in a firewall that's basically 2 walls adjacent to each other without a horizontal offset? So we do look at that obviously with when taking that into consideration. But look at the end of 221 for some examples for that as well. So we'll keep moving here. And then these are just some examples, just pulled out of different resources that you can easily look up as well. This is just an example for masonry walls that's taken from the NCMA Tech Bulletin, and an example of one from the JIP Association, and that picture again, just to reiterate what this is supposed to look like if a fire does occur. And another old school example, generic firewall example. Again, these are just from resources that you can, I'm sorry, I didn't name that one. This is from the National JIP, but there are all kinds of resources out there to look at. And then of course, call us with questions too. So it bounced up a little bit, but 7062, I'm going to go backwards real quick, just so I can keep you what we're talking about in line with the code. So again, that was the section about the structural stability, that wall has to remain standing, well, no matter what happens on either side of it, and then it can be constructed in accordance with 221. And then there's an exception for that in seismic design categories D through F, where double firewalls are used in accordance with NFPA 221. Floor and roof sheeting not exceeding 3/4 inch thickness shall be permitted to be continuous through the wall assemblies of light frame construction. So 3/4 inch, you're not talking about the whole roof assembly, right? You got 3/4 inch that could remain attached there. And then of course, these design categories are applicable to structures that regulated by, yes, I still have OSHPD, it should say HCAI. So just a visual for that to help you out there. Here, what does that exception look like? You've got that maximum 3/4 inch roof sheeting up top that can go through, because if that roof ceiling or floor ceiling that burns and falls down, that 3/4 inch isn't going to tear that firewall down. And then what materials? The materials shall be of any approved non-combustible materials, unless of course you are in a type 5 building. And then the rating is not less than what's required in 7064. Here's table 7064. And you'll see, always remember your footnotes. So when you're looking at that table, make sure to look at the footnotes. And you'll see up on the top, you'll see where the I is, and it says you need 3 hour, but you can go to footnote A. In type 2 or 5 construction, walls shall be permitted to have a 2 hour fire resistance rating. That's again, not 2 and 5 together, but type 2 or 5 construction. Then the code goes on to horizontal continuity. I'm just deciding if I want to go into this in detail or go fast because we got a lot of other slides. We'll do some of it. We'll do a little of each. So horizontal continuity. You got this firewall. How is it supposed to terminate? So looking at 7065, firewall shall be continuous from exterior wall to exterior wall and shall extend at least 18 inches beyond the exterior surface of the exterior walls. Of course, the visual, of course, is showing you what that looks like. It's sticking out a little bit, 18 inches, not something most people want, but you see it a lot from 1970. But what are some exceptions? Of course, there are exceptions to that because we don't see that all the time anymore, right? So there must be something else in place. So some exceptions, instead of extending 18 inches beyond the exterior, exception 1, firewall shall be permitted to terminate at the interior surface of combustible exterior sheeting or siding, provided that provided is a big word, and people in the academy know when we see provided, they underline it, circle it, so it stands out that you can do this if you do these other things that follow. The exterior wall has a fire resistance rating of at least 1 hour for a horizontal distance of at least 4 feet on both sides of the firewall. And then openings within such exterior wall shall be protected by opening protectives, having a fire protection rating of not less than 3/4 hour. There's visual for that exception. So again, that instead of sticking out 18 inches, you're going to go sideways and go 4 feet out, protect those openings as required. Exception 2, firewall shall be permitted to terminate at the interior surface of non-combustible exterior sheeting, exterior siding, or other non-combustible exterior finishes, provided The sheeting, siding, or other exterior non-combustible finish extends a horizontal distance of at least 4 feet on both sides of the firewall. And then exception 3, firewall shall be permitted to terminate at the interior surface of non-combustible exterior sheeting, or the building on each side of the firewall is protected by an automatic sprinkler system in accordance with 90311 or 12. So there's some forgiveness there for if both buildings are fully sprinklered. So if you're building a firewall and you're wondering how to terminate it at the horizontally, go look at that section. You've got the charging section and 3 exceptions to look at. And then the exterior wall 70651, where the wall intersects exterior walls, the fire resistance rating and opening protection of the exterior wall shall comply with one of the following. Not all of them, just pick one that matches what you need and go with it. The visual here for this one, the exterior walls on both sides of the firewall shall have a 1-hour fire resistance rating with 3/4 hour protection where opening protection is required by 7058. That's not the right code sector. The fire resistance rating of the exterior wall shall extend a minimum of 4 feet on each side of the intersection of the firewall to exterior wall, and then exterior wall intersections at firewalls that form an angle equal to or greater than 180 degrees do not need exterior wall protection. So look at the picture. That if you just heard blah, 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 read it again, sort through it, and then look at the picture. It helps you out, helps you sort those pieces out. And then exception 2, buildings or spaces on both sides of the intersecting firewall shall assume to have an imaginary lot line at the firewall and extending beyond the exterior of the firewall. The location of the assumed lot line in relation to the exterior walls and the firewall shall be such that the exterior wall and opening protection meet the requirements set forth in 7055 and 7058. I'm pretty sure those are the wrong sections. I apologize. Such protection is not required for exterior walls terminating at firewalls that form an angle equal to or greater than 180 degrees. So then these examples, that's just giving you different, is exception number 2 of, how does this wall, what happens when you've got exterior walls adjacent to this firewall, and looking at, again, you have to have an imaginary property line to determine where that goes, how that's protected. Now you've got horizontal projecting elements. So we're talking about balconies, roof overhangs, the projecting elements. What do you do when those come into play and with the firewall? So firewall shall extend to the outer edge of these horizontal projecting elements, such as balconies, such as, right? So this isn't just an all-inclusive list, but such as balconies, roof overhangs, canopies, marquees, we don't see those too often, and similar projections that are within 4 feet of the wall. So this is saying that firewall extends to the outer edge of these projecting elements. But of course, there are exceptions to this. Horizontal projecting elements without concealed spaces, provided the exterior wall behind and below the projecting element has not less than 1 hour fire resistance rated construction for a distance not less than the depth of the projecting element on both sides of the firewall, and then openings within such the exterior wall shall be protected by opening protectives having fire protection rating of not less than 3/4 hour. Exception number 2, non-combustible horizontal projecting elements with concealed spaces providing a minimum 1 hour fire resistance rated wall. Excuse me, I read that wrong. Non-combustible horizontal projecting elements with concealed spaces, provided a minimum 1 hour fire resistance rated wall extends through the concealed space. The projecting element shall be separated from the building by a minimum 1 hour fire resistance construction for a distance on each side of the firewall equal to the depth of the projecting element. The wall is not required to extend under the projecting element where another word to circle, where the building exterior wall is not less than 1 hour fire resistance rated for a distance on each side of the firewall equal to the depth of the projecting element. Openings within such exterior wall shall be protected by opening protectives having a fire protection rating of not less than 3/4 hours. So when you read these exceptions, dissect them, read them piece by piece, and make sure you're catching all of it. If you just read it all in one like that, you might get bored and move on. But read them piece by piece, separate the sentences, or imagine that they're separated as they should be, and then apply that accordingly, and to understand it better, because they get kind of wordy. And exception number 3, and I'll give you visuals to help too, but for exception number 3, for combustible horizontal projecting elements with concealed spaces, the firewall need only extend through the concealed space to the outer edge of the projecting element. The exterior wall behind and below the projecting element shall be of not less than 1 hour fire resistance rated construction for a distance not less than the depth of the projecting elements on both sides of the firewall. Openings within such exterior walls shall be protected by opening protectives having a fire protection rating of not less than 3/4 hours. So what did I just say? There's a lot to that. So here's some visuals. Again, if you're keeping this presentation, make sure to keep the visuals as well. They help out. So on the right, you've got your exterior wall, and then you can see the going towards the left, you've got this projection, and then you have your firewall, and you've got the dimension equal to the projection on each side of the firewall. So what's the dimension of your projection? It's with the projection, and now you're going where that firewall would intersect and go out either direction from that projection, and that you'll have that openings on that are going to have to be, or in that space are going to have to be protected with 3/4 hour. And then for the other exceptions with the concealed spaces or no concealed spaces, on the left, you've got the one that doesn't have a concealed space, but it has a projection, and you've got the firewall. What happens there? You've got to have a 1 hour, shows you how to terminate with a 1 hour. When the exterior is 1 hour and the same openings are protected for 3/4 hour. And then what if you do have a concealed space? That firewall goes all the way through. And then do you have a continuation of the firewall if the construction is combustible construction? And then what if you have 1 hour? So match these up with they're in order, but match them up with the exceptions. They're in order of those. That helps you when you're dissecting those sentences and sections to have a visual to help understand that a little bit better. And then the vertical continuity. You've got firewall, so we talked about horizontal. Now what happens at the top? Firewall shall extend from the foundation to a termination point at least 30 inches above both adjacent roofs. So you got a firewall between the two buildings. It goes all the way up. Again, no horizontal offsets for the firewall, but then how does that wall terminate? All the way up and at least 30 inches above both adjacent roofs. But there are exceptions. What if you have stepped roofs? Which 30 inches from which one? Or do you even do that? So there are specific requirements for when you have a stepped roof, and you would go to 70661 for that. You have roofs of differing heights. And then exception 2, 2 hour fire resistance rated walls shall be permitted to terminate at the underside of the roof sheeting, deck, or slab provided, the big important word there, provided. So now you've got a 2 hour wall. So this isn't okay for everybody's wall if you need 3 hour, but if you've got a 2 hour, here's how this can terminate vertically. The lower roof assembly within 4 feet of the wall has not less than a 1 hour fire resistance rating, and another important word, the entire length and span of supporting elements for that rated roof assembly has a fire resistance rating of not less than 1 hour. So you got the firewall that goes up, it can terminate at the underside of the roof sheeting as long as that lower roof assembly within 4 feet of the wall is 1 hour. And the whole length and span of all the supporting elements for that 1 hour roof have that 1 hour rating. And openings in the roof shall not be located within 4 feet of the firewall. So you just butterfly it out, right? If you're familiar with that terminology. And you don't have openings in that 4 feet that you just came out. And then each building shall be provided with not less than a Class B roof covering. So in order to terminate the 2 hour, when you have a 2 hour firewall, in order to terminate it this way, like butterflying out, all of these provisions have to be in place. That one's not a pick and choose. So yes, that's commonly called the butterflying it or butterflying out. And again, just some visuals to help you through with what that might look like. And then exception 3 with its visual is when, so instead of extending 30 inches up, what walls shall be permitted to terminate at the underside of non-combustible. Make sure you're reading these clearly, which exception goes with what. Step roofs, 2 hour walls. This one's for non-combustible roof sheeting, deck, or slabs where both buildings are provided with not less than a Class B roof covering. Openings in the roof shall not be located within 4 feet of the firewall. That was an easy one. And then this is another version of a butterfly condition, but it's specific for buildings of type 3, 4, and 5 construction. Walls shall be permitted to terminate at the underside of combustible roof sheeting or decks provided. So if you're in the academy, I would say underlined for these last two, you want to underline non-combustible in exception 3. And number 4, you want to underline combustible. And provided there are no openings in the roof within 4 feet of the firewall. The roof is covered with a minimum Class B roof covering, and the roof sheeting or deck is constructed of fire retardant treated wood for a distance of 4 feet on both sides of the wall, or the roof is protected with 5/8 type X gyp directly beneath the underside of the roof sheeting or deck. And that gyp is supported by a minimum 2-inch nominal ledgers attached to the sides of the roof framing members for a minimum distance of 4 feet on both sides of the firewall. It's just another version of the butterfly condition. And then exception 5, in buildings designed in accordance with section 510.2, firewalls located above the 3 hour horizontal assembly required by 510.2, item 1, shall be permitted to extend from the top of this horizontal assembly. And exception 6, if you have sloped roofs, then go to 70662 for the specifics. And again, no offsets. You have a firewall, it's ground to ground to sky. Think of it that way. You don't have horizontal offsets, straight up and down. It's not a firewall that way. And then you can't have a cantilevered upper floor above it. I'm not going to read through these as much detail as I did the horizontal and vertical continuity sections. In those sections, it indicated to go to the specific sections if you have these conditions. Again, if you have a stepped roof and you have a firewall between these two buildings with roofs with different heights, go to this section to determine how to terminate that firewall. Just a visual of what that looks like with the stepped roofs. And some of the visuals that go with the language. And there are exceptions to that condition as well, and that the requirements for how those walls terminate. So make sure to read those exceptions, see if they apply to your condition. And then again, if you have sloped, it led you to 70662. You got a sloped roofs, go to this section and look at the specifics for how the firewall is to terminate when you have sloped roof conditions. And then combustible framing in firewalls. Adjacent combustible members. So now we've taught construction where you've got combustible components entering into a concrete or masonry firewall from opposite sides shall not have less than a 4-inch distance between embedded ends. Another one where visual is helpful, where combustible members frame into hollow walls or walls of hollow units. Those hollow spaces shall be solidly filled for the full thickness of the wall and for a distance not less than 4 inches above, below, and in between the structural members with non-combustible materials approved for fire blocking. So very specific when you've got combustible construction, which makes sense. What has to happen when these members are embedded into this firewall? So specific requirements for that. And again, the visual to help out what's okay, what's not okay, and what do these words even mean? Here's what it looks like. All right, we made it through firewalls. So we have fire barriers. The definition for fire barriers: fire resistance rated wall assembly of materials designed to restrict the spread of fire in which continuity is maintained. The term represents firewall assemblies with a fire resistance rating that are constructed in accordance with 707. So even though the definition applies to walls, remember that horizontal assemblies can also be fire barriers. So yes, a fire barrier is a wall, but when you have a fire barrier requirement, you're looking at a cube, right? You got top and bottom that need to be rated as well, not just the walls. Top and bottom are your horizontal assemblies. Horizontal assemblies have their own requirements, but they also complete this fire barrier cube, so to speak. But don't get it confused. Horizontal assemblies are one thing, fire barriers another, but they're related to each other. They come into play with each other. So again, you've got a cube. You need the whole thing protected. Fire barriers tell you how to build those walls. Go to the horizontal assembly section. They'll tell you how to build those. But those horizontal assemblies have to meet what the fire barrier is required to have. And then we'll go into, I won't read through all these as specifically just for timing. But the continuity, well, these are important, but the continuity of the firewall different since 2007, right? Here used to be able to, what some people call, dog housing it out, but 2007 and continues on today's code is the fire barriers are required to extend from the top of the foundation or floor assembly below to the underside of the floor or roof sheeting slab or deck above, and shall be securely attached thereto. So all the way through, straight up and down, the fire barrier goes all the way through from the foundation or the floor assembly through to the next floor ceiling assembly or the roof ceiling assembly. And it doesn't, if you got a roof ceiling assembly, it doesn't terminate at the ceiling portion. That would be a membrane. It terminates all the way through, all the way up into the roof portion of it, the roof portion of the assembly. And then some exceptions for shafts. There are different ways to terminate shafts. You would go to 713.2 to determine how to terminate the shaft. And then interior exit stairways and ramp enclosures also have their specific requirements of how they terminate. And you would go to 713.12 for that. A visual again, that fire barrier goes all the way up. Does not doghouse out anymore, does not terminate at that ceiling. Remember, a ceiling roof assembly is something together. The ceiling is one membrane portion and the roof is one, but together they create the assembly. So the fire barrier goes all the way through to the roof portion of that assembly. I know I just said it, but I said it again because it's always forgotten. So what are your fire barrier types? Shafts, interior exit stairways, and if you have interior ramps, and then exit passageways, horizontal exits, atriums, incidental uses, control areas, separated occupancies, and fire areas. These are all types of conditions where you would need a fire barrier. And general section for that, fire barriers installed as required elsewhere in this code. So other places of the code are going to tell you need this fire barrier. 7 is going to tell you to build it according to 707. And then tells you what materials you're going to need, what rating that is those fire barriers are going to need. What do you need when it's a shaft enclosure? Then tells you to go to 713.4 when you've got a shaft. And then the interior exit stairways and ramps construction to go to 1023.1, and then enclosures for exit access stairs, which are completely different things than interior exit stairways and something we don't see too much of course. But if you have those, go to 713.4. And then for exit passageways, leads you to 1024.3 for the specifics of what you need to do for fire barriers and exit passageways. Horizontal exits, go to section 1026. For specifics for creating fire barriers and horizontal exits. And then atriums, of course, have some special requirements as well. So go to 404.6 for your fire barriers that are for your atriums. So not done. Incidental uses, go to 509 to to determine the fire resistance rating. What does table 509 say that you need? Most of ours, and when you're in an I2, and you have an incidental use space, you're gonna need a 1 hour fire barrier and sprinklers. However, look at the table, because there are some specifics. When you have energy storage systems and different electrical equipment, etc., you can have some more specific requirements and may actually need a 2 hour. So look at the table to see what the hourly rating is for the incidental use that you're dealing with. And then fire control areas, to what rating do you need for that? Go to 41424. And separated occupancies, go to table 508.4 to see what that hourly rating is that you need for your fire barrier there. What do you need between your assembly dining and the rest of your I2? 2 hour. Typically, you're going to need 2 hour, but again, go to that table to verify the hourly rating between the different use and occupancy that you have. And these are, again, this is just telling you to go and just giving you the pictures to make it more entertaining. 509 for incidental uses, 41424 for control areas, and 5084 for separated occupancies. 707310, the table there. Remember, read the title of it. Some people just see a table, go with it, but remember to look. Are you looking at fire wall or fire barrier? What table are you looking at? Make sure you're looking at the right table. This is the one for fire resistance rating requirements for fire barrier, fire walls, or horizontal assemblies between fire areas. So you're talking about firewalls here, I say you, but the code's talking about firewalls here too, but firewalls specifically for fire areas, in between fire areas. And then what's a fire area? 707310, the fire barriers, fire walls, or horizontal, is not what it is, but it's telling what you need. The fire barrier, fire walls, or horizontal assemblies, or a combination thereof, separating a single occupancy into different fire areas, shall have a fire resistance rating of not less than that indicated in table 707310. The fire barriers, fire walls, or horizontal assemblies, or combination thereof, separating fire areas or mixed occupancy, shall have a fire resistance rating of not less than the highest value indicated in 707310 for the occupancies under consideration. So remember, when you're looking at this table and you see the word fire walls, remember this is when it's the fire walls it's talking about here are specific for fire areas, that when they're required for fire areas. Your fire wall rating that we already went through in 706 is when you need your firewalls for those reasons in that section. So what's a fire area? Is the aggregate floor area enclosed and bounded by firewalls, fire barriers, exterior walls, or fire resistance rated horizontal assemblies of the building. We're not getting into the details of these fire areas, but in CFC, you'll find some more information of when these might be needed. If you have them, you need to go here in the code for determine the requirements for those fire areas. Still on fire barriers, but talking about the exterior walls, where the exterior walls serve as part of a required fire resistance rated shaft or stairway or ramp enclosure or separation. Such walls shall comply with the requirements of 705 for exterior walls, and the fire resistance rated enclosure or separation requirement shall not apply, but then there's exceptions to that. So you're talking about you've got a fire wall and it's required because you've got a shaft or stairway enclosure or separation. Then it tells you go to 705 for what do you have to do for your exterior wall? How does that have to be protected? And it says it doesn't apply there, but then you've got exceptions. Exterior wall required to be fire resistance rated in accordance with 1021 for exterior balconies, exterior egress balconies, 1023.7 for interior exit stairways and ramps, and 1027.6 for exterior exit stairways and ramps. So it's the charging section is saying, all right, it doesn't have to be rated at the exterior wall unless it's otherwise required to be rated. So if you've got these conditions that are in the exceptions, make sure that you go to those sections to make sure that if your exterior wall needs to be rated, it'll tell you in those sections how. So yes, the charging section says you don't need to rate it, but you do have to rate it if it's otherwise required to be rated, and go to those sections that are listed in here. And then with the number 2, exterior walls required to be fire resistance rated in accordance with 1206 of the fire code for energy storage systems. So same thing. The exterior walls don't have to be rated unless they're otherwise required to be rated elsewhere in the code. And in 1206 for the energy storage systems, there will be specific requirements for rating those exterior walls when they need to be. So please don't assume that any exterior wall doesn't have to be rated. It may have to be, or at least a portion of it or a certain distance of it. So go to those specific sections for those specific conditions. That's kind of just saying the same thing differently. And then the continuity, again, it's the top of the foundation of the floor ceiling assembly below to the underside of the floor or roof sheeting, slab, or deck above. And this, I just put this here again because I put the visuals here and the visuals a little bit later, but here, so this is, I don't think you're designing the top of your stairs like this anymore, but just an example of what that fire barrier termination looks like for those. Or visuals, kind of self-explanatory. Supporting construction, this is something that seems to be forgotten often, and not always, and this isn't just for fire barriers, this is for all rated assemblies. When you have a rated assembly, whether it's the walls or the horizontal assemblies, whatever is holding that up, it needs to be, the supporting construction needs to be rated the same as what that assembly is required to be rated at. But have the conversation with your structural. Sometimes you've got bracing that may be there for structural requirements for movement, but if you lose it, if you lose that bracing in a fire, you wouldn't lose the wall. But you've got other types that if you lose that bracing's could be holding up that wall. And if you lose it in a fire, you're going to lose that wall. So have the conversation with your structural as well to make sure you're looking at the right, you're rating what you are rating what needs to be rated. Don't forget the supporting construction. And think about too, when you've got a fire barrier, like we recently had a building that had the construction type did not require it required a 1-hour floor assembly, but there was a use on the floor above, on the second floor, that required a 2-hour fire barrier separation. And during construction, it was found that this 2-hour separation that's on the second floor wasn't supported with the 2-hour supporting construction underneath, because the building element for that construction type only required that floor to be 1 hour. So make sure to look at all the pieces. If you've got a 2-hour fire barrier on a floor that's only required to be 1 hour, that floor is not rated the same as that wall, and that supporting construction needs that same rating. So anyhow, this section talks about that, and there are some exceptions to that for different construction types. Move through fire partitions. A vertical assembly, they're defined as a vertical assembly of materials designed to resist the spread of fire in which openings are protected. We usually see fire partitions where? In corridors. Those are where we usually see those. I listed the different areas where you see fire barriers. Fire partitions are your corridors, your 1-hour corridors. And they're in other, like as you can see in the language in orange here, they're also for separating adjacent tenant spaces and covered in open mall buildings. Obviously, we're not dealing with those. And to separate dwelling units and sleeping rooms, and to enclose corridors and to enclose elevator lobbies. That sometimes is forgotten. So we see them in corridors, but you may also see them for your elevator lobby. What can they be built out of? They're built out of the materials permitted by the type of construction. What are they rated? What are they required to be rated? In California, your corridors are required to be 1 hour rated. So yes, there's an exception for corridor walls to have half-hour, by table 1020.1, but don't even bother with it because that's not what we adopt here. We have 1 hour rated corridors. Other parts of the country, that is not the case. They can go down to the half hour and smoke. They have smoke partitions, essentially. But anyways, just keep it in mind, obviously 1 hour rated corridors in California. Then there's exceptions. Dwelling units doesn't apply here. Type for group B and high rises. And then continuity. How do you build your corridor? Well, if this language changed, the intent and the enforcement is the same, but the language shuffled a little bit to try to make it clearer. I think it was in 19. It could have been 16 mid-cycle. But how do you build your corridors? You have to see the note on your plan. Show the detail of your corridor construction. Which of these 4 types essentially did you use? So what you might have been used to in the old code, it looks different in today's code, but again, the intent, the meaning is still the same. They just try to clean it up to make somewhat more sense. So your continuity, your fire partition shall extend from the top of the foundation or floor ceiling assembly below and be securely attached to one of the following. Number 1, the underside of the floor or roof sheeting, deck, or slab above. You can see in the visual, it's the top one, item number 1, that matches with number 1 here. Or they can do the underside of a floor ceiling or roof ceiling assembly having a fire resistance rating that is not less than the fire resistance rating of the fire partition. To your example there in number 2. So read this carefully too. These aren't exceptions here. This is just saying this is part of the charging section. Here's how your fire partitions extend to the top of the foundation or floor ceiling assembly below, and then are securely attached to one of these. Then there are the exceptions. Exception number 1, fire partitions shall not be required to extend, there's an extra couple spaces there, into a crawl space below where the floor above the crawl space has a minimum 1 hour fire resistance rating. There's a visual for you there. Exception number 2, fire partitions serving as a corridor wall shall not be required to extend above the lower membrane of a corridor ceiling, provided, the word you circle, right, that the corridor ceiling membrane is equivalent to corridor wall membrane, and another word to circle, so we don't just stop reading because you're like, sweet, I can enter that in my ceiling membrane. That you got to do a little bit more. And either of the following conditions is met. To 1, the room side membrane of the corridor wall extends to the underside of the floor or roof sheeting, deck, or slab of a fire resistance rated floor or roof above. Look at the top picture for that one. What does that look like? And then 2, so this is your or the building is equipped with an automatic sprinkler system installed throughout in accordance with 903311012, including sprinklers installed in the spaces between the top of the fire partition and the underside of the floor or roof sheeting, deck, or slab above. That's your visual on the bottom. So both above that ceiling portion would have to be sprinklered, and of course below the ceiling. And then exception 3, the fire partition serving as corridor wall shall be permitted to terminate at the upper membrane of the corridor ceiling assembly where the corridor ceiling is constructed as required for the corridor wall. So the ceiling looks like what the walls look like. You got your typically your 2 layers of 5/8 air gap in between. So that's what you're used to seeing for your walls. This exception is saying you do that same thing for your ceiling. So you turn that horizontally, you got basically the same thing. Then your corridor can look like that. So those, when you're asked for, the note indicating how you're constructing your corridors, this is a great resource for you to help sort that section out. And please don't say tunnel, because if you look at all these, don't they all look like tunnels? Please don't say tunnel. Call it what it is, and indicate which one you're using. We get it. We know tunnels were used, and back in 50s, 60s, that there weren't all ton of different options, right? They basically were tunnels, but now there are different ways to construct that. So please don't tell us that you are creating a tunnel condition. Name it what it is and indicate which of these that you're using. And then exception 4 is more malls, so we're not going to get into that. And again, supporting construction, whatever's holding those walls up needs to be supported the same as, rated the same as that wall. So for us, you got 1 hour rated corridors. The supporting construction also needs to be 1 hour, and then as like the barriers, there's exceptions for 2, 3, and 5B construction. And again, to make sure to have that conversation with structural, is this wall for movement, or is this support for movement only, or is this support actually holding the wall up, where if the support burns down, the wall falls down? Make sure to have that conversation so you're protecting what needs to be protected. And then 70842 is section for fire blocking and draft stops in combustible construction. So you've got combustible construction, please go here to determine what you need to do for fire blocking. This isn't really forgotten, but it's not always understood completely either. We can go through some of it. We're getting a little bit short on time here. But again, in combustible construction, where fire partitions do not extend to the underside of the floor or roof sheeting, deck, or slab above, the space above and along the line of the fire partition shall be provided with one of the following. You see these. So a lot of you that are dealing with the SNFs, the skilled nursing facilities of the 5A construction, this is your world here. So the fire blocking up to the underside of the floor or roof sheeting, deck, or slab above using materials complying with 718.2.1. So it's not just this section. What happens at the top of that fire partition, the top of that wall, from the space between the top of the wall and the roof sheeting? What has to occur there? This is the section to go to for that. And then in number 1, saying to also see 718.2.1 for the materials that you can use in that space. 2, draft stopping up to the underside of the floor, roof sheeting, deck, or slab above using materials complying with section 718.3.1 for floors, or 718.4.1 for attics. So again, make sure you go into the section that is applicable to what you are looking at. And then exceptions to this: the buildings equipped with an automatic sprinkler system installed throughout in accordance with 90331. 1 or 1.2, provided that protection is, there's too many provided in there, provided that protection is provided in the space between the top of the fire partition and the underside of the floor, roof sheeting, deck, or slab above, and required for systems complying with 9033111. And then talking about where corridors, where the corridor walls are provided for sleeping units or dwelling units. We don't do that one very much, but the first one definitely. So the first one is you don't need the draft stopping necessarily in the I-25As, but you've got these other requirements have to be in place, like the sprinklers. What is fire blocking? It's building materials installed to resist the free passage of flame to other areas of the building through concealed spaces. There are exceptions for the fire blocking. And again, the fire blocks and draft stops in combustible construction, that was 70842. And if you used to look at all those in 718, not all of those exceptions are there anymore. You still have to go to 718, but exceptions 3, 4, and 5 are now in this section here with 708. And as I mentioned, the fire partitions and continuity have been reformatted. And as we have already read through that, fire partitions, how they terminate exterior walls when you have, well, we'll just read this one. Where exterior walls serve as part of the required fire resistance rate of separation, such walls shall comply with the requirements of 705, your exterior wall section. And the fire resistance rated separation requirement shall not apply except, so another section that says you don't have to rate it at the exterior unless it's otherwise required to be rated. So if there's a rating that's required for egress balconies, for the stairs, for the interior exit stairs, and for exterior stairs, then it does have to be rated. So charging section saying it doesn't have to be rated unless other sections of the code say these things have to be rated. Here's a visual for you. The top one is we have a fire resistance rated corridor. You don't have a, sorry, I blocked out part of it. Anyways, you got the 1 hour fire partition there. That exterior doesn't have to be, but what if you have an exterior exit balcony? Then that exterior portion of the fire partition will have to be rated because the other sections of the code say it does. 711 is the horizontal assemblies. If you notice, that is not the title of this section anymore. They are still talking about that, but they changed the title to be floor and roof assemblies. So CBC 711 is still for your horizontal assemblies, but people will get confused. Your ceiling's horizontal, right? Is that a horizontal assembly? No, not by itself. It's part of one, but it's not by itself. So they changed the name of it as floor and roof assemblies. To be clear, this is what we're talking about in this section. The horizontal assembly shall comply with 711.2. Non-fire resistance rated floor and roof assemblies comply with 711.3. So what is a horizontal assembly? A fire resistance rated floor or roof assembly of materials designed to resist the spread of fire in which continuity is maintained. Again, I'm reiterating it just because we get this question a lot. Well, my ceiling's in a horizontal position and it's rated. Is it not a horizontal assembly? It's not. It's one part of it. The roof ceiling assembly would be the horizontal assembly. The floor ceiling assembly would be the horizontal assembly. And horizontal assemblies, of course, are important for completing compartmentation. Again, you have a cube, right? Just like when you have the fire barriers, you need a cube. You need top, bottom, and all sides. Compartmentation, same thing. This is where that comes into play. You've got, as we mentioned, your fire barriers. Here are your walls. Here's what they need to comply with. Now you got the top and the bottom of that cube. How is that protected? Same with smoke compartmentation, right? You got smoke compartments. They're not just smoke barrier walls. It's in a compartment. It's this whole cube. I'm not probably using the right word, but you got all top, bottom, all sides. Just a visual, throw a picture in there. The general section for this, horizontal assembly shall comply with 711.2. We already read it. Horizontal assembly. Why is it? The horizontal assemblies shall comply with 711.2, 1 through 2.6. So 2.1 talks about materials. 2.2 talks about continuity, same as the rated walls. We talked about how do those walls terminate. We didn't talk about that. I just thought that when any rated assembly, when you hit the exterior, that's got to be carried all the way through the interior sheeting of that exterior wall. You're doing that with the horizontal assemblies as well. So you've got your rated floors, your rated floor ceiling assemblies. When they hit the exterior, that's got to be carried all the way through the 2 layers, right? You don't just end at that interior, that first layer of the exterior wall goes all the way through to the interior sheeting of that exterior layer of the exterior wall. So your continuity for horizontal assemblies is the same, just like your walls do. Supporting construction, that we already talked about. Reiterate it, whatever's holding up that horizontal assembly has to be supported the same as what that horizontal assembly is required to be rated at. What are they? What is the rating needed for those? So go to 241 through 246, but again, there will be specifics in other portions of the code that will tell you what these assemblies have to be rated. When you're separating mixed occupancies, go to 5084, separating fire areas, 707.310. There's for dwelling units and sleeping units. When you're separating smoke compartments, you also look at 709. And don't forget lobbies, there's requirements there for lobbies. You have to have that smoke containment at those lobbies as well. Even though your shaft is protected, you've still got smoke compartmentation that has to happen floor to floor. You do see that with the lobby or smoke containment. When you're separating incidental uses, go to 509. Again, very similar to fire barriers, right? The sections tell you where to go when you have to have these separations. Go to 509 for determining the rating that you need for incidental uses, and then other separations, other portions of the code will tell you what those separations required to be, what the ratings required to be for those separations. Like, again, that energy storage system like we talked about. Ceiling panels, this section talks about laying ceiling panels and the requirements for those. When you've got an unusable space under a floor, what has to happen there. The materials, continuity, so assembly shall be continuous without vertical openings except as permitted in 712. So you got a hole in your floor, you got to protect it. Smoke barriers, they're continuous, either vertical or horizontal, and they extend exterior wall to exterior wall. This is just example. You've got the one in the middle, the smoke barrier in the middle is separating smoke compartments. It goes to exterior wall, but remember the wall terminates at the interior seating of the exterior wall, not where this is shown here, but that's not what this detail is supposed to be showing you anyways. You also would need smoke barriers in other places where the code requires it, like in an elevator lobby in a situation shown here, or at your stair enclosure. But the one on the right, that little square that's supposed to be a little smoke compartment in a bigger smoke compartment, that would not comply because those walls do not terminate at the exterior wall. A smoke compartment is a space within a building enclosed by smoke barriers on all sides, including the top and bottom, of course. The general section for smoke barriers, vertical and horizontal smoke barriers shall comply with this section, of course. What materials can they be, and whatever is required for that type of construction. And then what does it have to be rated as? 1 hour fire resistance rated is required for smoke barriers. And there's an exception for I3. We don't do I3s, we do I2s. That exception's not ours. Continuity. The smoke barriers, again, they go, well, I'm going to read this one. I know we're getting close in time, but of course this is important in our world. Smoke barriers shall form an effective membrane continuous from the top of the foundation or floor ceiling assembly below to the underside of the floor, roof sheeting, deck, or slab above, including continuity through the concealed spaces, such as those found above suspended ceilings and interstitial structural and mechanical spaces. The supporting construction is going to be the same as the wall rating required for the wall. When you're using smoke barriers to separate smoke compartments, again, they go exterior wall to exterior wall. And then if they're required for enclosing lobbies, elevator lobbies, or refuge areas, then go to these appropriate sections for those conditions. This just says what I already said. Outside wall partitions, we don't really see. But as I'm showing in this picture, this is one area where we do with when your elevator, you've got your rating of the shaft that your elevator's in, but you still have a smoke barrier requirement from between the floors. And this is one of the ways, this isn't the only way, but using the smoke containment in front of the elevator cab door is one way to maintain the smoke partition protection there. But you can also have lobbies. There's not a list provided in the code where you see smoke partitions, but we provided one here for you. It's, again, in corridors and I2s in other parts of the country, not here. We have 1 hour fire partitions. Elevator lobbies and sprinkler buildings, you go to 30063, item number 2. And then there's something similar to smoke partitions in 50942 for incidental uses, but again, this doesn't have to do with us because you need the separation and the sprinklers. And what are some of the other things that have to do with fire resistive rated assemblies? Your vertical openings, penetrations and fire stopping, joint systems, opening protectives like your doors, your windows, your glazing. What do they need to be rated at? What's the size? That's limitations that are in the code. Ducts and dampers, you got concealed spaces, FT&L ratings. Continuity we did talk about, but that's in here as well. Supporting structure we talked about, and there's more. So when we do a second presentation, a lot of these items will be, I don't know if we'll get through all of them, but a lot of these will be addressed in that second presentation. So that is it. Not a whole lot of time for questions, and I just threw out a whole lot of information at you. Your head might be spinning. As I mentioned before, feel free to ask your questions here. If you need time to process, some people that hear this, see it and process right away and get it. Others, you need to read it and think about it a while, to ask questions whenever they come up. This isn't just now or never. Yeah, you can contact me at any time. So Monica.
Yes, Nancy, you did amazing. So
Thank you, Monica.
really good, really good. We have 5 minutes left, so we are going through questions, and the questions that we will not have time, we will respond by email. So,
Okay.
Nancy, are you ready? Let's try to do as quick as we can.
Yes.
One question says, do we use the most stringent graphic symbol for a wall barrier that meets multiple fire resistance rating?
So we want to see all of it. So you'll show when you have a multiple use wall, we want to see the details for both. So if you're talking about the legend, if that's what you mean, what do we want to see on the legend? And not just the legend, but on the plan itself, show both. So sometimes we'll see, and you don't have to do it the same as everybody else, but 1 hour fire barrier, smoke barrier, the number 1 FBSB, if you want to do that. And then when it transitions over and it's just a fire barrier, then go ahead, take the SB out and put the SB wherever it changed course. Or same with fire partition. You got 1 hour, 1 FB, FP. Though that might be a little harder to see on the plan, so you maybe want to put a different graphic for that. Show both. Show both so that we can follow that along the path that those walls traverse. Please.
Yeah, wonderful. That makes sense. Thank you.
You're welcome.
The next question is, I thought that all no-rated smoke walls have to be minimum 1 hour fire rated now by definition. Is correct?
We have smoke barriers have to be 1 hour. Yes. And we don't have, well, I should say that those smoke, I'm not sure where you would see the non-rated smoke partition. Again, in other parts of the country, you will have that for your corridors. But in California, you have 1 hour fire partition, but the smoke barriers are also 1 hour.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. Next question. So how much time we have? 3 minutes. Okay. Is the firewall really intended to stand indefinitely if the required, hold on, because it's moving now, the question is the required construction on either side is less than the rating of the firewall itself? Isn't the rating of the construction intended to allow occupants to evacuate in the given time?
So great question, because that's what we really focus on, our timing. And in I-2s, it takes a lot of time to relocate people. And yes, there are provisions for the different construction types that come into play based on timing for evacuation or when needed, or in our case, relocation. However, remember the firefighters. Well, the firefighters are going to be here fighting this fire. And if the wall's crumbling on them, we don't want to kill a bunch of firefighters. So it's not just the occupants of the building, it's also firefighters, as well as protecting the adjacent building. So yes, the intent is that wall stays standing for the time that table says it needs to. You got 3 hour, it needs to be 3 hour, even if you got 1 hour building on the other side that's crumbled and on the ground. Well, it's 5A, you get the 2 hour. But anyhow, if you've got that, if it's required to be 3 hours, it needs to be 3 hours regardless of, I don't want to say regardless. The table says 3 hours, that needs to be standing for 3 hours. So it's, again, it's firefighters as well. We're protecting them too.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Next, what are the main differences in construction between fire partition, fire barrier, and smoke barriers? I understand that fire barriers, any supporting structural bracing, requires to have the same rating as the fire barrier. For smoke barrier, there is an L rating at joints and penetrations.
So a few different questions in one, right?
Right.
So as far as what do they look like if you're standing there looking at it, and why do I need to call this something different if they both have a layer of 5/8 on either side with an air gap in between? They may, but the way those openings are going to be protected will differ depending on the type of construction, the type of wall that is. And then where the L rating comes into play, well, let me back up a little bit. Supporting construction, any rated assembly the supporting construction needs to be rated the same as that rated assembly. So that doesn't differ between the fire barrier, fire partition, etc., unless it falls under one of the exceptions. But so the supporting construction has to be rated the same as the rated assembly, regardless of the type of assembly. So it's not just fire barriers, it's all of them. And then for the L rating, that is for smoke barriers. And yes, that L rating is needed for the smoke barriers. And remember that could include the floor assembly or the ceiling assembly. And if you've got a multiple use wall, you may need an L rating, even though you're saying, well, it's only a fire barrier. Well, if it's a fire barrier, smoke barrier, you still need to have that L rating.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So the next question, and questions are coming up now, and so I'm looking the screen and it is getting insane. So the next question is, what about utilities, piping, electrical, mechanical that crosses a firewall? One would think this could affect the structural if collapse occurs on one side. So what happens in those utilities for piping, electrical, and mechanical across firewall?
If those are permitted, so remember, it depends on the type of wall that you have and what it's there for. If those penetrations are allowed, there will be requirements for the support of those as well, but which will be in different portions of the code applicable to those to whatever you're looking at, whether it's mechanical or ducting or piping. And then there's also, just kind of crosses over, you got structural separation that's required versus fire. If it's both, if you have a separation there that's needed, it's needed seismically as well, then there are going to be some flex connections and such that come into play. If it's the firewall's there for fire purposes only, there are some other requirements in different sections of different codes and standards, which obviously is way too many to get into right now, but there are other requirements that will address those issues and the support of those components as well.
Got it. Thank you, Nanci. It's 11:32, so we are already over our webinar. So we got many questions, and Nanci, if it's okay, you will answer to those questions by email to the specific people, or how we can respond in general to those questions to let everybody know. But please, if you have any other question, don't hesitate to write an email. There are also past two webinars where you can download the presentation handout and video presentation, like the CAN 2-111B, Assemblies in the Health Facilities, OSHPD 3 clinics for the what, when, and how, temporary structure and uses, and is the CAN 2-108, engineering judgment for the CAN 2-703.3. There will be, Nanci, I believe, the part 2 of your presentation, a continuation.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Sorry about that, a step over you there. We could address some of these questions in there too, and some of them may automatically be part of that presentation because there are questions about openings and joints and such. I forgot to say that one piece about AIA. If you're I don't know if that's what they're called, then contact your specific division or region for obtaining those CEUs. Sorry, credit.
No, that's perfect, Nanci, of course. So for any other presentation and to stay tuned for any update, remember to subscribe to our website at www.hcai.ca.gov, and on the upper right of the screen there is the word subscribe. You will click there. You would provide your name, your email address, and you will select what area you would like to be notifying. For example, building safety and financing, design and construction, wherever you are interested, click there so you will get the notification. Please remember again, if you have any project-specific question, to send those questions to the regs unit at hcai.ca.gov. And Nanci, do you want to add anything more?
Thank you. Thank you for your help. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Thank you for your questions. We will, or I guess it will be, I will get to your questions. And Monica, I'm not sure if there's is that the same email you want those questions to go to that you just gave?
Yes, the regs unit at hcai.ca.gov, REGSUNIT at hcai.ca.gov. So that being said, it's been a pleasure being with all of you today. Thank you for what you do and for doing your part in providing access to safe, quality healthcare environment throughout the state of California. And until the next time, have a good rest of the day. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Monica.